Iran has warned it will take appropriate measures against what it's called excessive demands and irresponsible behavior of the European signatories to the 2015 nuclear deal. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman called on Britain, France, and Germany not to follow Washington's maximum pressure campaign. Abbas Mousavi also denounced as illegal an anti-Tehran resolution the three countries submitted to the IAEA Board of Governors just last month. The official said that such meddlesome approaches can adversely affect Iran's cooperation with the UN nuclear watchdog. He added that Foreign Minister Mohammad Zarif has written a letter to the EU foreign policy chief referring the trio's non-compliance with the deal to its joint commission. And joining us now for this news review is Jerome Hughes, Press TV correspondent from Brussels, and Tony Gosselin, investigative journalist, joining us from Bristol. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program. I guess, Jerome, we'll start with you. The latest you have out of Europe.
Well, Daniel, I think there is, if you look at the statement that Josep Borrell, the EU foreign policy chief, has issued, he refers to the communications that he's had with Iran, and it's reasonably diplomatic. I mean, the thing is that there's no doubt from the EU side that they keep saying time and time again, certainly in public, that they see the JCPOA as a very important deal. It's an international agreement. It's underpinned by the United Nations, and the EU side keeps saying that, it's very important to keep it alive, and they want to keep it alive. But the problem is, I think there's a lot of frustration in Tehran in relation to what they're hearing, behind the scenes, and then what they hear in public. The problem is the lack of concrete actions in terms of the EU standing up to Donald Trump. And there's this theory that keeps going around now, and it's growing legs in terms of momentum, that the European Union is basically having a sort of a stand back, wait and see approach. Let's find out. Let's see if Donald Trump doesn't get reelected in November. If he doesn't get a second term, then, everything is back on the table and normality can resume. So that seems to be what the European Union has been doing, because if you look at the mechanisms that the EU promised to try and save the JCPOA, those mechanisms haven't been up and running. The EU has not compensated for the United States withdrawal from this historic Iran nuclear deal. And so now what they're doing is they're saying, well, look, time is running out for Donald Trump. They genuinely hope that time is running out for him. And they're just standing back to see what happens next.
Jerome and Tony, I noticed you've been waiting for quite some time to get this news review cracking up. I want to welcome you to the program. Mr. Tony Gosselin, your initial thoughts, please.
Well, look, if they're waiting for Donald Trump not to get re-elected, well, they may be waiting in vain, mightn't they? The fact is that the European Union's got to act. It's no point in just talking and talking without doing anything. And I mean, we've seen the US sanctions around the world against Iran, which are really the end of this 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, having an enormous effect. In fact, basically a chilling effect on all the companies all over the world are now thinking, gosh, if I trade with Iran, I'm going to get in trouble and I'm going to get sanctioned. I might get my chief executive or chief financial officer arrested, as has happened to Meng Wanzhou from Huawei over in Canada. The United States is basically being the bullies of the world, a bit like the British used to be when in the days of empire. And this is a real, I mean, it's a very important agreement. The reason why is it was designed to stop a war, a potential nuclear war between Iran and Israel. And the fact that the Americans have pulled the plug now means that that war is more possible and more likely. Now, look, sanctions are also very important as a warfare method, because what they do is it makes it that, I mean, this is why the Israelis are so happy that the sanctions are up again and the JCPOA has been effectively torn up. I mean, obviously, there are still some people left in it, and it's nice to see the Europeans haven't just given up completely, but they need to be action in Europe, because the point is, if the US companies, corporations, etc., if corporations and companies in Europe are trading, doing nice deals with Iran, this is a really good way to stop there being a war. Because if there is a war, if there is a smaller war in the Middle East, many of these companies and countries will be looking at it and saying, well, we don't want this war, Israel, because it's going to damage our income and it's going to damage our finances. Now, the fact that there is sanctions means it's much more likely that a war will happen, and that the Europeans will either turn the other way, come out with loads of mealy-mouthed words and no action as usual, and the same with the United States. That's why this deal is so important.
Thank you, Tony. And Jerome, my next question to you. We've seen the kind of demands the Europeans have put on Iran's nuclear program. Tehran is saying they've been excessive. I mean, have they even been paralleled in history? Have we ever seen, a nuclear program under such scrutiny before?
Well, look, the European Union really follows the foreign policy of the United States. We see that in terms of not only Iran, but many other countries as well. But the thing is, the EU actually, I believe, considers, if I speak to senior officials here in Brussels in the European Commission, they actually consider Iran to be a good actor. They use this word actor, but it's a good actor in terms of the context of the JCPOA, that it did uphold its end of the bargain, so to speak. And it really was Donald Trump unilaterally making the decision to pull the United States out of the Iran nuclear deal that created all the problems, because Iran was doing all that it could to comply with all the conditions, and then it started to row back from its commitments, but it didn't fully pull out of the deal at all, even though it probably would have been much the easier thing to do. And all the provocations that the United States has imposed on Iran ever since, in terms of the maximum pressure, in terms of trying to provoke Iran in all sorts of ways. And you can say maybe that's Donald Trump, but it's more likely perhaps or certainly a large extent, the people that surround him, the war hawks in Washington. And yet Iran has managed to stay the course. And so actually, in all of this, and on an international stage, obviously, certainly with Russia and China recognize it, but even beyond that, internationally, I think the world sees that actually it's the United States that is completely unreasonable, and it's Iran that has been provoked, and the provocations against Iran, and yet Tehran has not actually fallen for it. Iran hasn't taken the bait and actually, really gone to town. It could have really gone out of control many times, as we know, in recent years since Donald Trump came into power, and yet it hasn't, and that is down solely to the powers that be in Iran.
And Tony, when you're going to make these kind of excessive demands of a nation, especially when you're under contract with them, why not? What happened to give a little diplomacy? Because it's not like it wouldn't be a sign of goodwill. It's under the contract that Iran was to benefit. Lip service, like saying, what Washington did was wrong. This unilateral pullout was wrong. We're not going to follow suit with, and we're going to try to set up some kind of a payment mechanism so Iran can still trade, with countries and basically circumvent these banking sanctions that it has on it. I mean, and to Jerome's point, calling it a good actor, that's great. It sounds more like Tom Hanks than Iran. But what is that? That doesn't really pay the bills, does it? Saying good things and praising Iran's commitment to the JCPOA, calling it a good actor, what does it do for Tehran's economy?
Well, look, I agree with everything you say there, and it doesn't make any rational sense whatsoever, unless you're a warmonger that wants to encourage a nuclear war. And by the way, it's Israel that has nuclear weapons. Apparently, they've had them since 1967, since the Six-Day War and the October War in the 70s. They had nuclear weapons, and it's a nation that was created by terrorists. The British should remember this, since those terrorists were killing mostly British soldiers and British police in the British-mandated Palestine at the time, and the Prime Minister now is an ex-Special Forces state terrorist. So we should be rather concerned about the nuclear weapons being in these hands. But look, the reason it's irrational and it's not being sorted out, particularly in the English language world, is because of the media. The mass media over here is just simply not interrogating the facts. The former UN weapons inspector, Scott Ritter, he has explained exactly what's going on here, and he can see the mass media isn't listening to him because it's the wrong story. They want the story Iran bad, Israel good, because they want us on side. If there is a war, they want us on Israel Israel's side. That Reuters had their annual trust survey out for the UK last week, and it's an absolute disgrace. The trust in the news here in Britain, that's newspapers, television and radio, all of it, the mainstream news, that is, the London media, is now down to 28%. So only 28% of people watching the television and reading the newspapers actually trust what they're seeing and reading. This is the lowest it's ever been. It's the lowest in the world, and it's down 12% from last year. So you can see what's going on here. The media is just spinning things pro-Israel all the time, and the public simply don't trust the press and the media anymore. So that's why it's so important what you're doing here with Press TV. At least there is some voices out there of sanity, because the actual policy of trying to tear up this JCPOA could possibly lead to a world war. It's totally irrational, and the Israelis particularly need to be called out 100% for what they're doing, and it's their lobby in the US which is mainly responsible for this, people like Jared Kushner.
All right, gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Time has gotten the better of us. Jerome Hughes joining us from Brussels there, and Mr. Tony Gosselin joining us from Bristol. And viewers, that's a wrap for the segment of your Press TV's News Review. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye for now.